So firstly, thank you all for coming. I'd like to echo Sir Ryan's notion that it's really good to see people here from very many disparate backgrounds coming together to look at what is undoubtedly a rather controversial and difficult subject. I'm going to do a little bit of an overview. These are the projects, the people that funded the project and our project partners. This poster is up in various parts of the Royal Society, but just be aware that it's a big group of people with incredibly diverse backgrounds, and that's really the power of us coming together organically rather than it being prescribed, actually, to talk about this topic from various different facets, and that's what I hope you take away from the meeting. So we're going to break this down into three parts. The PIs are going to give you a sort of summation of where we are at the moment and a summary of what we've, the top line stories, if you like, about the projects. And then we're going to delve into the details of the science, the social science, the engineering, with presentations by each of the different projects. And then we're going to have a panel meeting at the end, which is going to broaden the debate, involve people from Europe and the US. And I hope that you find all of these illuminating. So, where are we? Well, this is me. I'm a humble volcanologist by trade. 3.5 years ago, I'll be honest, I'm not even sure I knew what geoengineering was. I certainly knew what climate change was, but I was inspired to think about this topic because the drivers behind it, the severity of climate change, is rather real. So I've called my talk Cold Comfort, which I think is quite a good pun. Everybody should have a good pun. Alan Robock's Smoke and Mirrors to talk about SRM, I think, is particularly good. In the past, I've called it Screams from No Man's Land as an homage to Michael Mann, because it actually is a very, very difficult field to work in. We have to stay true to our beliefs, and we have to be absolutely intellectually honest about this. Just a very brief review. I apologise because I'm sure almost all of you know this, but we'd be remiss if we didn't at least have one slide on this. So you can broadly slice geoengineering technologies or techniques in four ways. So this is a slide I've shamelessly borrowed from Steve Rayner. So along the bottom you have whether or not you would consider the technique to be some sort of Earth system enhancement, or whether or not you would consider it to be some sort of hard engineering. That sort of belies the fact that actually you'd need pretty decent engineering to do at least stratospheric aerosols, but probably ocean fertilization as well. And really the broad brush slice is between techniques that draw down carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and those that increase the albedo of the Earth and so reduce global temperatures, noting that the latter do little for other problems associated with CO2 like ocean acidification. So this is the slide that Sir Brian was referring to, and it's worth going through this a little bit. Jim Hayward made a point at a meeting recently that actually we should always start with this slide, because there's a question of why are we doing this? Why are we doing this research? This is why. This is the latest projections from the International Panel of Climate Change. And the alarming thing, which again Sir Brian highlighted, is that these two scenarios actually explicitly include negative emissions technologies. So there is geoengineering of the flavour of carbon dioxide removal in the best case scenarios. The very, very alarming thing for us is that we are on this path here. That's AR 8.5. We are slap bang on this trajectory, and that puts us in a very, very different place in our children's or our grandchildren's lifetimes. It's worth also noting, and this is a point that I'm going to home in on a little bit, that these little ticks, this particular orange section is observations, and these little drops in temperature are associated with volcanic eruptions. And because I'm a volcanologist, that's what I've chosen to study. So we can see from the temperature record that actually volcanoes do influence global temperature. I'm very proud of SPICE. It's been a challenge, it's been extremely enjoyable, and actually I've made some very good friends. But it's an unusual alliance between people who are interested in volcanoes, atmospheric physics and chemistry, engineering, and climate modelling and land process modelling. And I think the chances of these groups of people coming together under any other sort of umbrella than climate engineering would be rather difficult to imagine. Our project particularly focuses on Pinatubo as a natural analogue. So Pinatubo conducted a large-scale experiment for us in 1991. It's particularly well observed, and that provides the benchmark by which we can judge various other opportunities or various other techniques. So the project was founded in science and engineering, but actually has broadened because, as John Shepherd correctly pointed out quite early on, you can't do science in a vacuum, particularly not this sort of science and engineering. So the project is broken into 4 parts. The first 3 were designed at the Sandpit event that the Royal Society hosted, and the 4th, which is this idea of engaging with people and making sure people understand the project, our motivations behind the project, was added a little way in. I should point out that every time I use the acronym WP in the future, it stands for work package. So they're broken down into 3 broad brush approaches. So what might we put into the stratosphere? Should it be sulfate or something else? If we do that, how are we going to get it there? And if we do that, what might happen? It is a feasibility study. That's a thing to remember. So you're going to hear quite a lot about the engineering assessment and the impacts on the environment later in the day. So I thought I'd focus in a little bit on the chemistry and physics of the particles and a little bit about the engagement exercises, the lengths we went to make sure people understood what we were doing and what we weren't doing. So I'd be remiss in my duties as a volcanologist. It's part of the paperwork that you get when you sign up to be a volcanologist, that you have to have at least 1 slide of a volcano in your talk. This is Pinatubo. This is actually not the main event of Pinatubo. This is a vent-clearing eruption 3 days before Pinatubo. And the effect we're looking for, if we choose to do this, is captured in the right-hand 2 slides. This is a before and after shot taken from the space shuttle across the atmosphere. And this dark line here is the aerosol veil that developed after the injection of SO2, which is dissolved in the magma of the volcano, which then converts to sulfate aerosol, which is what's doing the climatological acting. It's what's reflecting more sunlight back out into space, and it's what's then subsequently cooling the planet. And we have quite good observations. It's about the time when we started to make really good observations using satellites. And so what we can see is that we can observe and quantify the effect. We know how much SO2 is produced. We know the optical depth of the aerosol veil, which is what this particular slide speaks to. And we can see the spreading rate. So we can look at the rate at which the aerosol layer spread around the tropical regions and then spread to the poles. So the bottom line is actually we have good measurements of the emissions from this particular event and the impacts. And that means that we can do some work thinking about what would happen if we did this artificially in anger. We see some things that are quite concerning. This is a plot of rainfall, and what you have, if I can get the laser to work. I'm not very good with technology, so I might shoot myself in the face. No, there you go. So we've got 3 eruptions: Agung 63, El Chichon 82, and Pinatubo 91. And what we can see, particularly in the tropics, so this is global rainfall and this is tropical rainfall, is we can see drops in precipitation following eruptions, particularly in the tropics. And that is a concern because water is a vital resource, and injecting aerosols into the stratosphere may have the impact of changing rainfall patterns, which is clearly something we'd have to be very, very concerned about. So what we set out to do with that in mind, to try and reduce impacts, is we developed a thought experiment which said, okay, can you do better than sulfate aerosol? Are there things out there that would behave more ideally and might be more controllable? I appreciate that sounds like a hubristic statement. It's really not meant to be. But you can construct an argument that suggests that the ideal particle would be very strongly reflective. It would have almost no infrared cross-section, so it wouldn't act like a greenhouse layer. And it would therefore have minimal impacts on stratospheric dynamics. It also wouldn't influence ozone chemistry, and it would be safe for the Earth's ecosystem when it fell out. So what we challenged ourselves to do is go away and look at different particles and try, opposite those challenges, to try and figure out whether there are any particles that existed that might behave like that. So one of the things we have to worry about is ozone loss after the Pinatubo event. So on the right-hand side here, we have a plot of observed ozone, and this drop here is associated with the injection of particles, injections of gas that converts to particles from volcanoes, and the surface of those particles acting as a catalytic surface to either promote the production of the chemicals that remove ozone, or to promote the destruction of chemicals that act as a sink for the things that destroy ozone. So the ozone chemistry is reasonably well understood, but nevertheless somewhat complicated, and it's certainly true that we have no idea about any other particles than sulfate and what they might do on ozone. There's a little bit of work on silica, because actually that's where so silica is a founding part of both desert dust and volcanic ash, which does occasionally get into the stratosphere but doesn't tend to linger particularly long. And so what we did at Cambridge is we took a series of measurements. I don't have time to go into the details. We might do a little bit later. But in essence, here we're interested in a chemical N2O5. What N2O5 does is it mops up chlorine. And so the presence of it in the stratosphere is a good indicator that actually you're likely to have less of an impact. And what these chaps did, and this diagram is incredibly schematic, is they pumped various gases over a flow tube upon which was coated the particles that we were interested in, and looked at reaction rates. So Marcus asked me, when he gave a talk in Warwick, he pointed out, which I think was rather clever, that actually real chemistry labs don't look like that. This is his lab, but it is in essence doing the same thing. And what the postdoc that he and I share discovered is actually that on Titania, which is one of the titanium dioxide, one of the particles that we were looking at, this particular reaction, the removal of N2O5, was about 100 times slower than it would be for sulfate aerosol. So if you're interested in looking at that particular species and that particular reaction, this is, and I would like it noted that I'm putting this in quotes, a positive result for that particular idea. The neat thing about SPICE is that we have various different disciplines involved in the project. So what we could then do is then pass those results to chemical modelers, atmospheric chemical modelers at Cambridge, who then ran a series of models to look at what the N2O5 concentrations, or the change in concentration, might be like using sulfate aerosol injection or using Titania. And the answer is that Titania has very little effect on this particular reaction. To be even-handed, there are a lot of other things we need to do. This is not raising a flag for this particular idea, particularly it's one step along the way. The next thing you'd have to do is probably think about what happens if you bathe this reaction in UV light, which is what would actually happen in the stratosphere. It's also at a different temperature and pressure, of course. So really interesting science, really interesting results, but one of the take-home messages is quite a long way to go. If we then move on to the engagement part, work package 4, it was realised quite quickly that actually people were going to be interested in this, and we had as publicly funded scientists, engineers and social scientists, we had a desire, and we were beholden to communicate what we're doing to NGOs, to the public. And actually this has become a very important part of all of the projects, particularly for SPICE, not least because it wasn't particularly planned to start with. I'm not going to go into the details of this paper, but I'm particularly proud of this paper because it is a social scientist and Jack Stilgo, a volcanologist and an engineer, writing about Frankenstein in a biological journal. It's an incredible thrill to be able to explore these things with people from different disciplines, and that's been really one of the positives that's come out of SPICE. We were minded quite early on to think about governance. There is some governance. You will learn a lot more about this from people that are much more expert than me later in the day, Steve soon and others later. But there's some architecture that exists, but it's not particularly well tuned towards geoengineering. So the Convention for Biodiversity does mention it, but my personal position, and I'm not an expert, is it's a fairly weak legal instrument. And so the funders decided that actually we had to think a little bit harder about that, and rightly so, in my humble opinion. You'll hear more about this from Hugh Hunt this afternoon. But they challenged to think about 5 criteria by which the outdoor balloon test might become legitimised. And the things that we were challenged with, which we found particularly difficult, were how to communicate it effectively to lots of different people, how to engage with people that really were quite strongly opposed to any research in this field, and also what it might do for the future, whether or not this would encourage more research, whether or not it might be used in different ways that we didn't want it to be. And this was difficult. It made us have to think like social scientists, which was challenging. So we were challenged to communicate. We focused on the media, which was a bit of a mistake, actually. We were somewhat naive in that. We didn't talk to people like NGOs, environmental NGOs, until later than we should have done. We did take media training with ASTER UK, which actually was invaluable. And we spent a lot of time talking to people through the media, particularly at the British Science Festival. So I might challenge Andy Parker, if he's in the audience, to tell me what this in the background is. Do you know what that is, Andy? Where are you? Would you like a clue?
Yeah, I wonder why you're picking on me.
Okay. It's AstroTurf.
Ah, okay.
So Andy introduced me to a new word, which is astroturfing, which is the generation of false grass roots. And so a lot of nonsense was written about spice and public outcry, which actually just isn't true. Thanks, Andy, for that. Sorry for picking on you. When you talk to the public, they give you very sensible answers. Is it safe? How would you test it? How would you control it? When would it be used? You know, what happens if it goes wrong? That's the thing that they always want to know. And these are questions of governance, and that's rather important. So the challenge of SPICE was to think outside of our comfort zones in science and engineering. Jack Stilgo joined the group and wrote a series of recommendations or observations, which I think were useful. This is a snapshot. If you're interested, I would read his report, because there's some other things in it as well, and this is just the things that I've picked out. But I think he felt quite strongly, as we did in hindsight, that consultation might have taken place earlier in the project because it was so controversial. He gave us a lot of credit by saying that we didn't rebut those criticisms, we took them on, and also that we were making the rules up as we went along. This is a new thing. The people that designed the stage gate, some of them are in the room, and the scientists involved tried as hard as they could to make this thing work. And it was a bit of a badgers moving goalposts maybe, but it was a very vital thing that we did, and actually rather useful. And we were very clear about the fact that we were quite uncomfortable in places. You'll notice if you read the papers today, I've been quoted several times as saying that this stuff scares me, and I think people need to know that. We also learned some lessons on interdisciplinarity, a lack of social scientists at the original sandpit with whom we were encouraged to interact was actually a bit of a deficiency. And if we move forward with this, social scientists have to be part of the flavour of people that are thinking about this stuff. It's good that we have to do that. Developing a lingua franca actually took SPICE an awfully long time, but I'm very proud of the effort and empathy we took and we went to. We applied in order to actually be able to talk to each other in a reasonable fashion, and that was actually even difficult between physical, natural scientists and engineers, let alone social scientists. Personally, I found it very, very difficult to disentangle my personal feelings about geoengineering, which aren't particularly positive, from professional framings where I have to be absolutely objective about the results that I'm generating. I think it's important to go back to observations we make about climate change and say there are some very strong drivers for knowing about this stuff. And I have been quoted today as saying there is and I strongly agree with this, just to absolutely make the point, there is a point at which it would be morally questionable, in fact morally wrong, not to intervene somehow. And we look like we're going there. So one point I would make is there are no neutral framings, there's no nice way or legitimate way, single way of describing this project. So this is a cartoon from ETC, which is obviously fairly negative. This you can read in two ways, depending on how you feel about medicine and surgery. It could be people messing with, unnecessarily messing with nature, or it could be a slightly more medically based analogy, which people would probably feel a bit more positively about. If you talk about volcanoes, or particularly about afforestation, and these are themes that will come up throughout the meeting, people generally tend to feel a little bit more positive about geoengineering, but you need to be aware of the effect that you have when you start talking about geoengineering in these different ways. So where next? Just a summary. I've written an article in the Guardian, which were kind enough to publish, which said we'd be mad to rule out climate engineering. We would be. We have to be thinking about this stuff. It's just the consequences of not doing something and not being able to do something are severe. I make the observation that Apple, and I don't know why I picked on Apple, I wasn't smart enough to make the connection with the Royal Society, sorry, but they spend about $1 billion a year on research and development, and in this country probably five and a bit million has been spent over 5 years, which I don't think is enough. You cannot conduct research through a single myopic lens, and this is going to require a strong support from government and research councils if we want to take it forward. I'm done. Thank you very much. Questions? So when you get handed a microphone to ask a question, if you could give your name and your affiliation throughout, because it's being recorded and we want to be as accurate as possible. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Alan Gadian, NCAS, University of Leeds. I'm making a plea that perhaps there's more going on than you've actually represented. For example, we've got a major group, including people in Edinburgh, University of Washington, all over the world, who are looking at marine cloud brightening. The error bars in the marine stratocumulus on radiation are twice as large as any double CO2 effect. So when you talk about geoengineering, I think we should also include the error bars, the uncertainties in what we know. And we're planning to do a large, not a small experiment, to look at the large-scale effects of this. So I think there is a lot going on out there that perhaps you haven't, and especially in this, and at AGU we're going to do some more next week.
Sure.
So there is a lot more, and the marine cloud brightening always gets ignored in this.
So firstly, that's a fair point, Alan, from two positions. Firstly, I think everything should be discussed and everything should go through the same level of scrutiny. I guess slightly defensively, I would point out that this is a meeting particularly about the stuff that we have done, but you are absolutely right to highlight that there are huge holes in our knowledge and our funding pattern, and actually nothing should be off the table. I'm not prepared to say that I think stratospheric aerosols are any better than marine cloud brightening. I don't think we know at the moment, and so everything ought to be on the table, I think.
Okay, Duncan McLaren, IAGP advisor, Spice Stagegate panel member, a few other hats. Matt, you said very clearly there's a point at which it becomes morally wrong not to intervene.
Yeah, I'm quoting you, by the way, there.
Yeah, I know.
Okay.
Well, maybe I just say then you can quote the other part of that as well.
Yes.
And what do you think the moral status is of doing things before that point?
Well, I think the difficulty is, so to be even-handed, Duncan, you're exactly right. There is also a range of trajectories, which if I had more time, I would talk more about, where it's actually morally reprehensible to intervene. I don't know when that time point is, and I don't think we will know when that time point is. I would also make the observation that, and I can't, you have to take this with a pinch of salt, but let's assume David Keith is right, okay, and gentle early introduction of sulfate is right. Just because that is right, that doesn't mean that's what we will do. Okay, so that's a very good point. I don't think we know the answer. I'm not sure that the answer is true from a scientific and a political perspective. So scientifically when it's right and politically when it's right, I suspect are vastly different.
Thanks.
Is that okay? Okay. David.
Thank you. Yes, David Santillo from the Greenpeace Research Labs at University of Exeter. Matt, thanks for that. Each time I've heard you speak about SPICE, you always mention this difficulty in separating personal and professional framings. And I just wonder whether you feel that that's something that's specific to SPICE, or whether something that's specific to this type of project or this field. I mean, why is it that that's something that you emphasise each time?
I guess a straightforward answer, and an engineering researcher at Cambridge wrote a really good article on this in an Australian magazine, which I'll send to you, which is titled "What's It Like to Work on Something You Hope Never Happens." And I don't think it's specific to SPICE for sure, but I think it is quite unusual for scientists to work on things where their personal opinion about that for the most part, is probably either neutral or negative. And I'll be honest, David, the reason I say that all the time is because I'm constantly being accused of being an advocate for this technology. And what I'm an advocate for is an evidence base. And we don't have the evidence base, so how can we possibly be anything other than agnostic about deployment?
Matt, thank you. Colin Pritchard, University of Edinburgh. You're talking about evidence-based, and you had your model results there for the consequences of Pinatubo over time, and it significantly omitted the polar regions. Was this intentional, or was this lack of data, or is it very difficult to extrapolate into polar regions?
I think we assumed that we would be injecting it above the tropical tropopause, which is why those results look the way they do. You will hear later, I think, from Jim Hayward about what happens if you try and inject in one hemisphere rather than the other. So, and also actually from IGP about a specific idea of trying to protect the ice sheets. So that is all coming. This is just the first round.
Thanks very much. Andy Sterling from Sussex. Matt, I really appreciate and admire the way you engage with different framings and present the science. I think it's really crucial. But I wanted to ask you about the extent to which, in your mind, engaging with social science goes beyond that. It's not just a question of personal relations and idiom. And so a starting point for that might be your statement just a few seconds ago. How can it be, what was it about being impossible to be anything other than agnostic? Impossible to be anything other than agnostic.
It's not, okay, it's not impossible, maybe unreasonable.
Yeah.
Which is worse, I know you're going to pick up on that.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So my point is really that when one takes social science seriously, one sees a system at least as complicated in its own way as a science system, with enormous uncertainties and with dynamics of power and plurality that mean moral positions are just one element of much more ambiguous ethical positions, so that doesn't carry the same kind of traction you emphasized. And also the way power and social mechanisms work mean that we might take a moral position with disastrous consequences. So I just wanted to raise whether you think that engaging with social science brings in those kinds of things, as well as being so admirably reflective of as you're being yourself.
No, it absolutely does. So if you polled 100 scientists and engineers about what social scientists could do for them, I think the vast majority would say, you can take my results and communicate them to stakeholders in the public. And that's not what we want, right? That's not fair, because that's not their job and that's not their remit, they're academics. But also that's no use, okay? So the whole point about SPICE is that it doesn't exist on its own. I made this point that quite early, that my desire for SPICE in the interim, at the beginning of the project, sorry, was to make it aethical. So to separate the can we from should we. I don't mean unethical, I mean aethical, before you laugh. And actually I discovered very quickly that you can't do that. And actually it was a conversation with Phil McNaughton who said, what about technological lock-in? Have you thought about that? That made me realise that actually there are scientific but also societal impacts associated with doing this research. So that's what I need to know.
Thank you. Stefan Singer, WW International. I'm a scientist myself, I'm a physicist. I agree with you strongly that research is driven not by the differentiation between personal and political opinions. I mean, being a physicist, I think I have hardly seen any group of professionalists and scientists who had been that opinionated on various issues. And I think it's a good thing. I think we need to keep that in mind, and as long as we keep that open and say that open, it puts things into kind of political framing. I think it's very important to keep that in mind. There's no such thing like an independent neutral scientist. I don't think that exists. Nor am I neutral. My question goes to another point of view is, if you observe the political climate debate in the last couple of years, in particular the IPCC coming out with AR5, how would you explain or reason that AR5, after the substantive and most comprehensive review of climate science, is pretty dismissive, is pretty agnostic towards at least solar radiation management? I know they look into some kind of carbon capture and storage, negative emissions, but not in the context of large-scale geoengineering in that context. I think they're very careful. And if you look at the summary for policymakers, and particularly Working Group 1, It just appears at the very end of the SPM, and this is what politicians are reading. And basically you could read out of that one, there's more in the underlying chapters, I know, but you could read out of that one, don't put a penny into that one. I think it's pretty strong, given that the IPCC is not policy prescriptive, but rather policy advisive. Second, how would you explain that the Convention on Biological Diversity, interestingly, at least promotes a strong ban on certain solar engineering activities, in particular marine fertilization with iron, from a couple of biodiversity and other reasons. How would you explain that politically? Where does it fit in your request for more money, for more research, for avoiding a planetary catastrophe? I mean, I agree with you. I think we have the same kind of disaster looming there. I think we see the same danger. But how would you explain that in a political context?
I'll keep my answers brief because I'm really not qualified to answer either of those questions in particular detail. There are people in this room that are much more expert than I am. I think in terms of the AR5, my suspicion is that they were very worried about legitimising SRM. I think they were beholden on talking about CDR in great detail because it is part of the more attractive-looking representative concentration pathways. But even that, the mention of SRM in the summary for policy makers provoked a very, very strong response from people that really object to SRM. So I suspect they were mindful of that. Okay, so this isn't meant to be derisory or inflammatory, but I suspect the reason the CBD has been focused upon is because the most vocal environmental NGO are geographically and ideologically aligned and are very familiar with the CBD. So I think, and I've actually told them this, I don't think it's the way to go. I don't want biodiversity impacted any more than anybody else. But actually there's an awful lot of experiments that you could do that I'm not sure we're ready for yet that would have no impact, no tangible impact on biodiversity. So at deployment level, I think it's a very interesting idea. At sub-perturbation level, I'm not sure it's the right instrument.